So Showtime put out some footage of Jake Paul doing some bag work alongside Coach BJ Flores and boxing featherweight world champion Amanda Serrano, and it wasn't very well received to say the least. BloodyElbow.com, my go-to place for combat sports news, wrote a scathing review of this footage, and even seemed to imply that Jake may be in way over his head against Woodley based on this training session. But does this bag work really give us any indication of Jake's skills leading up to a fight with Woodley? And more interestingly, how does Jake look side by side in comparison to a world-class boxer like Amanda Serrano? Well, let's jump right into this and find out. Real quick, this is Kiwi MMA, and if you're new here and enjoy combat sports breakdowns, especially on more unconventional fighters and matchups like YouTube boxers, then please subscribe to the channel below, and feel free to leave some comments below about the sparring footage, as well as check out my other videos on this fight if you want more info on this exciting matchup. And without further ado, let's jump into this. So for starters, let's just briefly explain what's going on here. So both Jake and Amanda Serrano are working their right crosses in the bag, right, just moving around, gauging the distance with the lead hand, and then throwing the cross down the middle. Just working on timing, consistency, just building more fluidity in that punch. Now, BJ Flores at one point says 10 more seconds.
Push! 10 more seconds.
So I assume this is likely the end of the training session, especially given how Jake looks pretty fatigued here and his punches seem fairly labored. Now, given that Jake and Amanda are doing the exact same drill, I'm going to refer back to her in order to contrast how Jake's form looks compared to hers, as well as get some insights into the gap in skill between the two. Now, one of the first things I notice here is the difference in how they gauge with the lead hand. Right, so obviously the lead hand in many instances is used to gauge for one's power hand. Right, because the power hand, due to the rotation of the hips, always extends further than the lead hand punches. And this is why you'll see boxers, and especially MMA fighters, sticking that lead hand out and trying to probe with it as a rangefinder. So depending on how experienced you are, you can know just from throwing that jab or sticking that lead hand out and getting close to your opponent's face, okay, now I know I can land the right hand from, say, this distance. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Amanda Serrano has a 65.5-inch reach, whereas Jake Paul has a 76-inch reach. So Jake's reach is a whole 10.5 inches longer than Serrano's. And yet, look at the difference in how they gauge with the lead hand. Right, Serrano, again, having a huge reach discrepancy compared to Jake, is able to gauge the distance and land her left hand without even touching the bag with her lead hand most of the time. Right, from years of training and sparring and competing, she knows exactly at what distance and at what range she needs to be in order to land that left straight. It's hard to tell if she even touches the bag once with her lead hand before landing the left straight. In fact, in most cases, she stops a few inches short of it, again, knowing that her left straight will extend further out. So her understanding of distance is really impressive, and along with her perfect punching form, it gives her the ability to sting the bag with each punch as opposed to trying to push or punch through it. Now look at Jake in comparison. With the longer reach and the ability to cover more ground than Serrano, Jake is literally touching the bag to measure for his right hand. Right, the distance Jake needs to be at to land the right hand is far too close. He could back up at least 5 to 7 inches, maybe even a whole foot to land this right hand. But instead he gets in close and touches the bag in order to gauge the distance. Now this is kind of backwards because you'd think he'd be trying to utilize his reach advantage by punching further out, but instead he does the opposite, which actually cancels out that reach advantage. Another interesting thing here is, because Jake's closer, it negates some of the snappiness in his punches against the bag. So because he's closer, he has to push through the bag a little bit more because his arm extends further out into it. This is typically known in boxing bag work errors as getting jammed up. You see this a lot with beginners who throw pushing punches, where they're trying to punch through the bag instead of snapping the punch against it quickly, and this actually makes it less powerful. So when you try to push punch through something, it's similar to almost like bench pressing. There's just no velocity and snappiness to the shot. Now, that's not to say Jake can't throw snapping punches, because clearly he can. It's just that in this scenario, his punches are less snappy due to him punching at a closer range, causing him to have to push punches through the bag more. Whereas Serrano, again, due to her understanding of range, stops her punch exactly on the edge of the bag like a whip, which is not only faster, but more powerful and effective. So that's one huge difference in skill right off the bat, being the ability to gauge distance effectively to land one shot. Serrano knows the exact range she needs to be at to measure for her power hand, whereas Jake seems as if he's still trying to find that sweet spot in this footage, or he's just tired and his form is lacking at this point. Now, another thing I notice is the difference in hip rotation as well as the pivoting of the rear foot between the two. So look at Serrano. She steps out slightly to her right because she's a southpaw fighter in order to line up her left hand, but also to get the momentum going to pivot her rear leg and hip. And look at her rear foot. Right, this is where the rotation starts when you throw across. She pivots it forward all the way to the tip of her toe. Now, to give a little background theory here, there's 3 elements to the lower body that trainers typically teach when throwing across, being the pivoting of the rear foot, the turning of the knee inwards, and of course the rotation of the hips. All 3 of these elements coupled with the rotation of the shoulders are what you need to throw a perfect straight punch. And pivoting the rear foot is crucial and generally the first step you're taught, because it not only teaches new fighters to twist and turn their body while punching, but also because the more you pivot the rear foot, the more you maximize the body twist and rotation, and therefore maximizing the body weight thrown into each punch. So especially during training, it's very important to work this rear leg pivot to get that body rotation perfect. But just to clarify, you don't always have to pivot your rear foot to this extent, and there are many examples of fighters pivoting in more subtle and less exaggerated ways, or not pivoting at all. And this is because, obviously in a fight scenario, the pressure and speed of the match leads to moments where you can't fully follow the fundamentals perfectly. But the main thing is sometimes you don't need to turn your rear foot all the way through like what Serrano is doing. A lot of the times you can get away with doing a slight pivot that's more subtle. And the important thing is to really turn the knees inward and rotate the hips while throwing the strike, and so long as you don't keep your legs totally straight, which can lead to no twist and i.e. arm punches, you can still throw the punch with good form. But it is true that typically the more you turn your rear foot, the more you bend your knees inward and rotate your hips, therefore maximizing the full body rotation into the shot. So during training, even though it won't always translate into the fight perfectly, this is a very good thing to do to get that punching form perfected. And Serrano is doing this pretty much textbook here. I mean, her rear foot pivoting is on point, and you can tell by doing this that she's able to maximize the rotation of her knee and hip inward to really put some pop on these shots while not overextending or over-rotating. Now, contrast this with Jake. So Jake's rear foot doesn't pivot as much, at least not to the point where his toes come up almost off the ground like Serrano. And he is turning his knee inward and rotating the hips, but it's just not with the same level of fluid rotation like Serrano. Like when you watch Serrano's lower body here, you get the sense that they're working together as one cohesive unit. But with Jake, you almost get the sense that he's throwing this punch in singular labored steps. It's almost like, okay, first I need to pivot my foot, then I need to turn my knees inward, then my hips rotate. It's almost like he's in slow motion in comparison. It's clear he has the fundamentals of punching rotation down, it's just that in this sequence they don't all seem to come together as one complete sequence, and again, fatigue could have played into this. And then we get to the last interesting point, and that is the difference in hand retraction after punching between the two. So everyone was talking about how Jake wasn't retracting his punches back to his face, and some of this is fair criticism and a lack of proper form on Jake's part, but some of this is also a bit of a misconception. Because while it's true that you should retract your hands back after throwing punches, this doesn't necessarily mean you have to keep your hands glued to your face while you throw punches or retract exactly back to your face after every punch. For one thing, this is extremely awkward and unnatural, and you can try this yourself at home if you want to test it, because to get the most fluidity in your punches, you want to keep them at shoulder level. Right, the punches start at the shoulder, so therefore they should return back to the shoulder. But if you keep bringing them up to your face, it's like you're retracting your punches back to a higher area of your body that's not in line with the natural pathway of your arm extension while you punch. Again, punches come from the shoulder and should retract back to the shoulder. They shouldn't retract higher than that. Okay, but then the question is, how do you keep your hands close to your face then? Well, if you lean slightly forward and tilt your head and your chin down, your chin is going to be closer to your shoulder level. So at this point, you can throw punches naturally from the shoulder level without completely exposing your chin. Okay, so now that we've covered that, what does Jake do and what does Serrano do? Well, Serrano, again, looks amazing and is following all this advice, and you can tell because every time she punches, that hand is coming right back to her chin because she's leaning forward and has her chin down. Now, how does Jake differ in comparison? Well, the first thing is, Jake's hands are lower, and this could just be due to fatigue, but look at this shot here of him and Serrano. Look at where her left power hand is, right close to her face. Now, Jake on the other hand has his at about shoulder level, but slightly lower, almost at his chest. His chin is slightly tilted down, but it's still kind of hanging out there a little too much, and he's definitely not leaning forward enough so that his chin is closer to his shoulder level. And what happens when he retracts his punch, it does come back to his shoulder, but he's not tilting his body and chin forward enough to protect his face. And you can see the opening on Jake's right side after throwing the punch for sure. Now again, I don't want people thinking I'm being overly critical of Jake. I get it, he's probably tired, and sometimes your hands just drop low during training. It's just to point out once again the difference in technique and fundamentals between the two. But yeah, that's all we have for footage here, and in conclusion, some really interesting stuff. I guess my closing thoughts would be Jake obviously has the fundamentals down, it's just when you put him next to a seasoned veteran like Serrano, the discrepancy in form and technique is definitely going to show. And I'll just note, a lot of MMA fighters who box exhibit these exact tendencies that Jake is showing here. Right, Jake's not alone here in terms of his lack of fine-tuning in some of these fundamentals. That's why it's going to be very interesting to see who has the better boxing fundamentals between him and Woodley. Because it's likely that Jake knows these things, obviously his coaches have drilled him not to do certain things, it might just be that the muscle memory isn't fully there yet when he's under stress. Can Woodley display better boxing defense and fundamentals with only 3 months of training? I guess we'll find out soon. But what do you guys think? Leave your thoughts and comments below. And again, thank you so much for watching, this is Kiwi MMA, over and out.